a mechanic in grease-stained jeans, a real estate developer who owned half the town, and one old land deed sealed in a rusted tin box. When Reed Calloway walked into Hargrove Capital's grand opening with his 9-year-old daughter and a folder of documents, he had maybe 5 minutes before security would remove him from the premises. What the crowd didn't know was that the man they were about to dismiss had the legal right to stop everything: the building, the ceremony, and the $30 million deal hiding underneath it. Reed's jacket was the good one. The navy blue he kept hanging on the back of the office door at Calloway Auto. The one Nora had bought him Christmas before she got sick. He'd ironed it that morning, which meant he'd burned a crease into the left sleeve because he'd never learned to iron properly and Nora had always done it. His daughter Emma had watched him from the kitchen doorway, eating cereal, not saying anything about the crease because she understood, at 9 years old, when her father needed to believe he looked okay. The Hargrove Capitol building sat on Main Street in Delwood, Tennessee, where the old Sinclair Hardware had been for 60 years before Thomas Hargrove bought it, gutted it, and turned it into something that looked like it belonged in Nashville. Glass front, polished concrete floors, a lobby with a waterfall feature that probably cost more than Reed made in a year. Today was the grand opening. Ribbon cutting at 11. The mayor was there. Local news cameras. A crowd of people in business clothes holding champagne flutes at 10:30 in the morning, which said something about the kind of event this was. Reed pushed through the front door with Emma's hand in his. She was wearing her school dress, the green one with the buttons, because he'd told her they were going somewhere important and she'd taken that seriously. The lobby hit them like a different climate. Cool air, expensive. Music playing from speakers you couldn't see. People turned to look at them the way people do when someone walks into a room wearing the wrong uniform. A woman at the welcome table smiled with her mouth. "Welcome to the grand opening. Are you on the guest list? I need to speak with Thomas Hargrove." The smile held. "Mr. Hargrove is unavailable right now. He's preparing for the ribbon ceremony. If you'd like to leave your name, it's about the property." Reed set the folder on her table. "The land this building sits on." Something shifted in her expression. Slight, controlled. She'd been trained for this. "All property matters should be directed to our legal department. I can take your information and someone will follow up. The ribbon cutting is in 20 minutes. Reed's voice stayed even. He'd rehearsed this. Stayed up until 1 in the morning rehearsing this while Emma slept. What's in this folder needs to reach Thomas Hargrove before that happens. If it doesn't, he's going to cut a ribbon on a building he doesn't legally own. The woman picked up a phone. Emma squeezed Reed's hand. She didn't say anything. She hadn't said much since they'd left the house. She was old enough to understand that something mattered here. Old enough to be nervous. 2 men in dark blazers appeared from a side hallway. Not aggressive, not yet, but with the particular stillness of people who'd been hired to be ready. "Sir." The taller one had a Tennessee accent and the build of someone who'd played football 20 years ago and kept most of it. "I'm going to need you to step outside. I'm trying to prevent a legal problem. That's not something we can help you with today." Reed looked past them at the crowd. Somewhere in there was Thomas Hargrove, who'd bought 2,000 acres of Delwood County land over the past 4 years, who'd built this building and 3 others like it, who was 20 minutes away from completing the purchase of the old mill property on Route 9. The deal that would let him put up the mixed-use development that would, according to the Delwood Courier, transform downtown. The mill property had belonged to Reed's grandfather, then to Reed's father, then 3 months ago when his father died to Reed. The problem was that Thomas Hargrove had apparently not been informed of this fact, or he had been informed and decided it wasn't relevant. "Daddy." Emma's voice was very small. He looked down. Her eyes were wide and fixed on the security guards. She'd seen him in difficult situations before. The garage had been broken into twice. There'd been the thing with the county zoning board last spring, but this was different and she could feel it. "Hey." He crouched down to her eye level. "It's okay. I'm just going to talk to some people. They don't want to talk. They will." The taller security guard put a hand on Reed's shoulder. "Gentle for now. Sir, let's make this easy." Reed straightened. He looked at the guard. He looked at the welcome table woman who was still holding the phone. He looked at the folder with his grandfather's name on the deed inside. Then he looked past all of them toward the back of the room, where a man in his 50s with silver hair and a navy suit was laughing at something, champagne in hand, utterly comfortable in the way of someone who'd never had a reason to be otherwise. Thomas Hargrove. Reed's voice came out louder than he intended, or maybe exactly as loud as he intended. The laughter stopped. Hargrove turned. He was handsome in the way that money made men handsome. Good haircut, good suit, the particular confidence that came from never having been told no enough times. He did the same scan that the woman at the table had done. The jacket with the burned crease. Emma in her green dress. The folder. Who are you? His voice carried. Reed Calloway. My family owns the mill property on Route 9. Something moved through Hargrove's expression. It was quick and it was cold, and if Reed had blinked, he would have missed it. I think there may be some confusion, Hargrove said. He walked toward them, the crowd parting. The Route 9 acquisition has been in process for. The acquisition agreement was signed with my father. My father passed away 3 months ago. Under the terms of his estate, the property transferred to me. Reed opened the folder, held it out. The deed is right here. The property isn't yours to sell. Hargrove didn't take the folder. He looked at it the way you'd look at something a stranger was trying to hand you on a street corner. These things take time to sort out legally, he said. Our attorneys have been in contact with the estate. They've been in contact with an estate lawyer who didn't know about the deed restrictions. The original 1962 transfer included a reversionary clause. If the land is sold to a commercial developer within the family line, the deed reverts. Reed heard his own voice going flat and technical, the way it used to in engineering meetings when he was at Ford, when he had to explain a structural problem to people who didn't want to hear there was a structural problem. I'm the family line. I haven't consented. The sale can't close. Hargrove's jaw tightened. Security, he said, not looking away from Reed. Please escort this gentleman outside, Mr. Hargrove. The ceremony starts in 15 minutes, and I'm not going to stand here and let a walk-in disrupt an event I've been planning for 6 months. The two guards moved. Reed didn't fight it. He let them take his arms, let them start walking him toward the doors, kept the folder pressed against his chest. Emma walked beside him, silent, her sneakers squeaking against the concrete. At the door, he looked back. Hargrove had already turned away. Someone had said something to him, something quiet, and he was nodding with the decisive nod of a man who'd already moved past the problem. Outside, the morning air hit Reed like something real. The guard stood in the doorway, not following them out, just making sure they kept moving. Emma slipped her hand into his. Are we leaving? She asked. No. What are we doing? Reed looked at his phone. He'd sent the documents to 2 people this morning. One was the county recorder's office, which wouldn't move fast enough to matter today. The other was a number he'd found after 3 days of making calls, following a chain of referrals that started with his father's estate lawyer and ended with a woman named Helen Pruitt who'd apparently spent 30 years doing nothing but untangling property law in small Tennessee counties. He'd left her a voicemail at 7 this morning. He called again now. She picked up on the second ring. Mr. Calloway. Her voice was dry and exact, the voice of someone who didn't waste words. I've been reviewing what you sent. Where are you? Outside Hargrove Capital's grand opening on Main Street in Delwood. They just had me removed. A pause. Did you bring the original deed? I have copies. The original is in a safety deposit box at First National. Good. Stay where you are. I'm 40 minutes out. The ribbon cutting is in 15 minutes. I know. Call the county recorder's office. Ask for Dennis Brower. Tell him Helen Pruitt sent you. He can pull the deed restriction record and verify it in their system. That verification number is what we need. She paused again. Can your daughter wait in the car? Reed looked down at Emma. She was watching him with those focused eyes that she'd gotten from her mother, that look of paying attention to everything. She's fine, he said. Helen hung up without responding to that. Reed called Dennis Brower. Waited on hold for 4 minutes that felt like 20. The ceremony was still audible from outside. Someone had opened the lobby's front panels, and music was drifting out, and the crowd noise was building toward something. When Brower came on the line, Reed explained. Brower put him on hold again. Reed sat down on a bench outside a shoe repair shop across the street, and Emma sat next to him, watching the Hargrove building like she was studying for a test on it. You're not scared? Reed asked. She thought about it. Are you? Yeah. She nodded like that was the right answer. Me too. But you said this was important. It is. Then we should stay. She was 9. She said it like it was obvious. Brower came back on the line. Mr. Calloway, I found the restriction. It's recorded. The reversionary clause is valid, and it's attached to the deed currently on file. I'm emailing you the record number now. Reed closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, he sent the record number to Helen Pruitt, and then he sat there with his daughter and waited for the world to catch up to what he already knew. Hargrove Capital's lobby was midway through the ceremony when Helen Pruitt arrived. Reed recognized her from the way she moved, which was like someone who'd spent decades walking into rooms where she wasn't welcome and had stopped finding it interesting. She was in her 60s, white hair, gray blazer, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen things. The ribbon's been cut, Reed said. I know. Cutting the ribbon doesn't close a deal. Helen didn't slow down. Come on. They went back through the front doors. The security guards started to move, and Helen already had her card out, already talking, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd won enough times that winning had become a posture. Helen Pruitt, Pruitt Property Law. I represent Reed Calloway, whose family holds deed restrictions on the Route 9 mill property currently subject to closing. I have a verified county record number confirming the reversionary clause and a certified copy of the original transfer instrument. She set her briefcase on the welcome table and clicked it open without asking permission. I need 5 minutes with Thomas Hargrove. This is not a request. The welcome table woman was on the phone before Helen finished speaking. The crowd had noticed them, not all of it, but enough. Heads turning, conversations tapering, the particular ripple of attention moving through a room. Thomas Hargrove came through the crowd with the contained fury of someone who'd expected this to be the best day he'd had in months and was being denied it. Miss Pruitt. His voice was careful, controlled. He knew her, Reed realized. They'd crossed paths before, or Hargrove had been briefed. Thomas. Helen's voice was pleasant. I've filed a notice of dispute with the county recorder's office this morning on behalf of my client. The Route 9 sale cannot close pending resolution of the deed restriction claim. That claim is based on documents that haven't been verified. The record number I just had your counsel check against the county system would suggest otherwise. Helen's expression didn't change. I understand you've been working on this acquisition for some time. I understand the closing was scheduled for this afternoon. I'm not here to make your day difficult. I'm here because the law requires this step. Hargrove looked at Reed, really looked at him this time, the way he hadn't in the lobby before, taking measure. Your father agreed to this sale, Hargrove said. My father didn't know about the clause. Reed kept his voice level. It was written in 1962. The estate lawyer missed it. I found it when I was going through my grandfather's paper, and now you want money. How much? Reed felt Emma's hand find his. I'm not here for money. Something moved in Hargrove's face, genuine confusion. It was the first real thing Reed had seen from him. Then what do you want? I want you to know what you're buying. Reed opened his folder, laid the pages out on the welcome table beside Helen's briefcase. Deed, survey. The original 1962 transfer document with the clause, typed in careful mid-century legal language. And something else, a report he'd put together himself over 3 weeks, a mechanical engineer's approach to a property problem. Photographs, records, structural assessments from the county, a summary document with the relevant facts in order. That mill property sits on an aquifer that feeds 6 residential wells in the Route 9 corridor, Reed said. The development plan your firm filed with the county includes underground parking that would require excavation to 40 feet. That excavation would compromise the aquifer. He pointed to the structural assessment page. 3 of those wells serve families who can't afford to be on municipal water. One of them is elderly, on a fixed income. She's been there 40 years. Hargrove was quiet. There's also a drainage issue that your environmental assessment understated. The engineer you hired looked at the property in August, which was a dry month. I looked at it in March and in November. The flood data is different. Reed tapped the photograph page. If you build what you filed, you're going to have a flooding problem by year 3 that's going to cost more to fix than the development earns. Hargrove's counsel, a man in wire-rimmed glasses who'd appeared at his elbow without Reed noticing, was reading the pages with an expression that was moving from professional skepticism toward something else. Where did you get the aquifer data? The lawyer asked. State Geological Survey. It's public record. I'm a mechanical engineer. I used to work in automotive, structural analysis, materials stress, fluid systems. This isn't complicated if you know how to read the data. Hargrove looked at his lawyer. Something unspoken moved between them. You came here, Hargrove said slowly, to tell me my own development has a structural problem. I came here to stop you from doing something legally invalid. The structural problem is what I found while I was trying to understand what you were planning to do with my family's land. The lobby had gone quiet enough that Reed could hear the waterfall feature. The crowd had arranged itself around this conversation without anyone directing it, the way crowds do when they sense that something real is happening. Emma was looking up at him. She'd let go of his hand. "Daddy," she said quietly enough that only he heard. "You sound like you do when you're explaining something at the garage." He did. He knew that. The flat technical voice, the ordered facts. He'd spent 15 years being the person in the room who read the data and told the truth about what it said, even when the truth was inconvenient. He'd done it at Ford until the layoffs, and then he'd come back to Delwood and done it for people whose cars needed honest assessments instead of inflated repair bills. It was the only way he knew how to do things. "Mr. Calloway." Hargrove's voice had changed. Not softer, exactly, but different. The performance was gone. "Are you saying the development as planned isn't viable?" "I'm saying the development as planned has problems that aren't in any of the documents your team filed. Whether it's viable depends on whether you're willing to redesign around the aquifer and address the drainage. It could be. The property is good. My grandfather knew that. He just didn't want it turned into something that hurt the people around it." Helen Pruitt, who had been watching all of this with the patient expression of a woman who'd learned to let situations develop, cleared her throat. "Thomas," she said, "my client isn't trying to kill your project. The deed restriction gives him the legal standing to block a sale that would damage the surrounding properties. That's what the clause was written for." She paused. "But it also gives him the standing to approve a sale that addresses those concerns. Those are two different outcomes." Hargrove looked at Reed for a long moment. "You want to be involved in the design," he said. "Not a question. I want the wells protected and the drainage fixed before anything gets built. I want a structural engineer who isn't yours to review the aquifer impact. I want it in writing before I sign anything." Reed met his eyes. "And I want you to know that the old woman on Route 9, her name is Patty Oakes, and she's been getting her water from that well since before either of us was born. She doesn't have anyone fighting for her except me and a 62-year-old deed restriction." Something moved through the lobby. Reed couldn't have described it exactly. Not applause, not drama. Just a shift, the way a room shifts when the actual thing in it finally gets said out loud. Hargrove's lawyer was whispering in his ear. Hargrove was listening, still watching Reed. Emma had moved closer to Reed's side again. Not scared. Just present. "The closing is scheduled for 3 o'clock, Hargrove said finally. "I know. Helen, can we postpone?" Helen's expression stayed neutral, but something in her eyes was satisfied. "I can draft an extension agreement. You'd be looking at a 45-day review period minimum. My client would need independent engineering assessment paid by your firm." Hargrove nodded slowly. "Fine." He looked at Reed. "I'm going to send my team to your garage," he said. "I want to see the full data you compiled. It's not a presentation, it's what I found. I know what it is." Hargrove's voice was dry, but not cold anymore. Something had settled in him that hadn't been there before. "My father was a civil engineer. I know the difference between a report someone put together to win an argument and an actual assessment." He paused. "Yours looks like an actual assessment." Reed didn't say anything. Hargrove extended his hand. Reed shook it. Helen was already writing something in her briefcase. The crowd had started talking again, the low, uncertain hum of people trying to figure out what they'd just witnessed. The waterfall feature kept going, indifferent to all of it. Emma tugged Reed's sleeve. "Is it done?" "Not done, better." "What's the difference?" He thought about how to explain it. "Done means finished. Better means it's going in the right direction." She considered this. "Are Patty Oakes' wells okay?" "They will be." She nodded. That was enough. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that complicated things sometimes were. Lots of movement underneath, the surface holding. Helen Pruitt filed the extension. Hargrove's firm brought in a hydrology engineer from Knoxville who spent a week on the Route 9 property and produced a report that confirmed, with more technical vocabulary and expensive graphics, what Reed had found on his own. The aquifer was real. The drainage concern was real. The development plan needed to change. Reed drove out to see Patty Oakes on a Thursday evening. She was in her 70s, small and particular, with the kind of focus that came from decades of living alone and making decisions without input. She had a glass of iced tea waiting for him, which meant she'd known he was coming before he called. "Heard you went and made a ruckus at that Hargrove thing," she said. "Something like that. Your daddy would have done the same." She said it simply, without sentimentality. He was like that, knew when something was wrong. Reed sat with that for a moment. His father had been a quiet man, not a fighter, not someone who made speeches. He'd worked the mill property for 40 years after Reed's grandfather died, keeping it up, leasing some of the grazing land, not building anything because he'd never had the money, and maybe because he'd known the land wasn't meant for that yet. He'd been sick for 2 years before the end, and in that time he'd talked to Reed about a lot of things. Emma, the garage, the state of American manufacturing, the Delwood High football team. But he hadn't talked about the deed restriction, hadn't mentioned it. Reed had found it in a tin box in the back of the workshop, underneath a 1987 Farm Bureau calendar and a broken watch that had been Reed's grandfather's. The deed with the clause typed neatly in the middle of page 3, as if the man who wrote it had known someone would need to find it eventually. "He didn't tell me about it," Reed said. Patty Oakes looked at him. "Maybe he thought you'd figure it out when you needed to." Reed drove home with the windows down, through the August evening, through the smell of cut grass, and the particular light that Delwood got in late summer when the trees were full and the shadows went long across the road. Emma was at his sister's for the night. The house would be quiet. He thought about his father, about the workshop where he'd found the tin box, about the property that had passed through 3 generations of his family without any of them knowing what to do with it except keep it. He thought about the day Nora died 4 years ago when Emma was 5, and the way the whole world had changed shape in the space of an afternoon. The way everything that had seemed important before, the promotion at Ford, the house they were saving for in Ann Arbor, the plans, had become something that didn't fit anymore, and how he'd come back to Delwood because it was the only place that still made sense, opened the garage, because it was work he understood, raised Emma in the house where he'd grown up, because Emma needed something that didn't move. He hadn't expected the property, hadn't expected any of this. But here he was. Helen called him the following Monday. "Hargrove wants to meet. His team has a revised design." What changed? The hydrology report scared them. "And I think you scared them a little too." A pause. "You don't do that often, do you? Walk into a room and make people listen." "Not really. You're good at it. I was an engineer. I'm used to delivering bad news about structural problems." "That's all this was," Helen said. "A structural problem." The meeting was at Helen's office, which was deliberate, neutral ground, her territory, not Hargrove's. Thomas Hargrove came with 2 people from his team and a set of revised drawings. Reed came alone. The new design moved the parking above ground, rerouted the drainage through a holding system on the north end of the property, added a buffer zone along the aquifer boundary that would stay unexcavated permanently. It cost Hargrove capital more. Less underground square footage, different construction approach, longer timeline. Reed looked at the drawings for a long time. "The buffer zone needs to be wider," he said. 20 feet, not 15. Hargrove's engineer started to object. Hargrove stopped him with a small gesture. "Why?" Hargrove asked. "The aquifer boundary shifts seasonally. 15 feet is the minimum in a dry year. 20 covers you in a wet year. You don't want to discover that in year 4 when the buffer is already developed." Hargrove looked at his engineer. The engineer looked at the drawings, made a note. 20 feet, Hargrove said. They went through the rest of the design. Reed asked questions. Hargrove's team answered them. Some of the answers were good. Some needed follow-up. Helen took notes with her fountain pen, not saying much, letting it run. At the end of 2 hours, Hargrove leaned back in his chair and looked at Reed. "What do you want out of this?" he asked. "I want the project to be done right. That's it? My grandfather built that property up from nothing. My father kept it for 40 years. Reed met his eyes. "I want whatever gets built there to still be worth something in 40 years. Not just worth money, worth something." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "I've been developing property in this county for 12 years. I've had people fight me. HOA boards, historic preservation committees, environmental groups. I've never had someone fight me because they wanted the project to be better. Reed didn't have anything to say to that. I grew up in Clarksville, Hargrove said. My father's firm did 3 projects there in the 90s that I know weren't done right. I watched them fall apart. Drainage issues, settling, one of them had to be condemned. He looked at the drawings. I've spent 20 years trying to build things that last. I'm not always successful. He paused. I'd like this one to be successful. Then use the right drainage coefficient and leave Patty Oaks's well alone. Hargrove almost smiled. It was a tired expression, a real one. Deal, he said. He extended his hand again, and this time when Reed shook it, it felt different, not the performed gesture from the lobby. Something more like an agreement between people who understood what they were agreeing to. Helen called Reed that evening. You want to hear the rest of it? What rest of it? Hargrove's firm filed an environmental disclosure amendment this afternoon. They're reclassifying the project as mixed-income residential, not commercial only. 30% of units will be rent-controlled. A pause. That wasn't in the original plan. Reed was at the garage, catching up on the Tuesday appointments he'd rescheduled for the Hargrove meeting. He set down the wrench. Why? I don't know. I asked Marcus. That's Hargrove's counsel. And he said, Thomas made the decision himself this morning before the meeting. Helen's voice was dry. Apparently, your mention of Patty Oaks got under his skin. Reed thought about Hargrove's face in the meeting room when he'd said the name. The small thing that had moved through his expression. He does this sometimes, Helen said. I've seen it in other cases. He has a trigger. Something makes him remember why he got into development, what he told himself it was for. Then he does something unexpected. She paused. You triggered it. Reed sat with that. Is the deed thing resolved? He asked. I'll draft the consent agreement tomorrow. You'll need to review it, but it's straightforward. You grant consent for the sale with the design restrictions attached as conditions. If Hargrove violates the conditions, the reversionary clause activates. Helen's voice was matter-of-fact. Your grandfather would find this outcome reasonably satisfying, I think. Reed didn't know if that was true. He didn't know his grandfather well enough to say. He'd died when Reed was 12, and what Reed remembered was a tall man who smelled like motor oil and pipe smoke, and never seemed to hurry regardless of what was happening. Maybe the deed restriction was the long version of that, not hurrying, waiting for the moment when it would matter. He picked up the wrench again. Helen, he said, thank you. Don't thank me. Your documents were impeccable. I just walked into the room with them. She hung up in her efficient way, no farewell. The garage was quiet at 7 in the evening. The bay doors were up, and the summer air came in, and there was a '09 F-150 on the lift that needed new brake lines, and the smell of the place, oil and metal, and the particular dry heat of the lights was the same smell it had always been, back to when his father had taken him here as a kid and let him hand over tools. Reed finished the brake lines, closed up the garage, drove to his sister's to get Emma. She was asleep on the couch when he got there, her sister's old quilt over her, some animated movie still playing on the TV. He stood in the doorway for a minute looking at her. She looked like Nora when she slept, the same position, the same particular stillness. He thought about all the things he couldn't give her, the mother she should have had, the easier version of their life, the one where he still had his Ford salary, and the Ann Arbor house and the plan that had made sense. The version where she hadn't had to sit on a bench outside a shoe repair shop in Delwood while her father tried to stop a real estate closing with a photocopied deed. But she'd been okay. She'd been better than okay. She'd told him they should stay. He carried her to the car. She didn't wake up until they pulled into the driveway at home. Did it work out? She asked, voice thick with sleep. Getting there. She nodded and walked inside and went back to sleep in her own bed, still in her clothes. Reed sat in the kitchen for a while, made coffee he didn't drink, looked at his phone, at the chain of emails between him and Helen and the county recorder and Hargrove's counsel, at the consent agreement Helen had already drafted and sent for his review. He thought about walking into that lobby in his navy jacket with the burned crease, the way the room had scanned him and found him lacking, the way Hargrove had looked at him with the particular impatience of a man for whom dismissal was a reflex. And then later, in the meeting room, the way that expression had changed. Not all the way, not into something uncomplicated, but into something more honest. People could be read wrong. They could be written off before they'd finished speaking. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you got the chance to make them look again. He signed the consent agreement and sent it back to Helen at 11:30 that night. The Route 9 closing happened on a Thursday 6 weeks later. Reed didn't attend. Helen represented him. She called him after. "Done," she said, "all conditions attached. Hargrove's team breaks ground in the spring. The Oaks well? Buffer zone is in the deed. Permanent. Any future owner is bound by it." A pause. "Patty sends her regards, by the way." She called the office. Reed was at the garage when he got that call. He sat in the office chair that had been there since his father ran the place, in the room that still had his father's handwriting on the scheduling board, in the building on Main Street in Delwood that he'd come back to because everything else had fallen apart and this was what remained. The summer outside the window was hot and ordinary. Someone was cutting grass across the street. The sound of it came through the open door, regular and indifferent, the sound of a regular day in a place that had known a lot of regular days. Emma came by after school, with a friend, the two of them getting sodas from the machine in the waiting room, dropping their backpacks on the plastic chairs. Emma told her friend about the garage, with the proprietary ease of someone showing off something she'd decided was worth showing off. Later, after the friend had gone home, Emma sat in the office doorway eating a granola bar and watching Reed work through the afternoon's appointments. "Is the property thing really done?" she asked. "Really done." She ate the granola bar, thought about something. "Do you think Grandpa knew?" she asked. "That the paper would matter someday?" Reed looked at the scheduling board with his father's handwriting. The neat capital letters, the shorthand codes he'd taught Reed, the system that Reed had kept because changing it had seemed wrong. "I think he kept it," Reed said. "Sometimes keeping something is the same as knowing." Emma considered this. She was getting to the age where she sat with things before responding, the thinking face that was all her mother and none of him. "That's kind of nice," she finally said. Outside, the August light was doing what it did, going long and golden across the street, the way it had every August in Delwood for longer than anyone currently alive could remember, the way it would keep doing long after the Route 9 project was built and occupied and became, in its turn, just part of the landscape. Reed went back to work. Emma did her homework in the waiting room. The garage stayed open until 6, the way it always had. Some things you kept, and in the keeping, they became what they were always meant to be.